The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 304, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge William Hartley sat behind his large oak desk, his silver-rimmed glasses perched low on his nose as he sorted through the day's cases. At 62 years old, he had spent the last 15 years building a reputation as one of the toughest judges in the county. The clock on the wall read 9:15 a.m. when Sarah Jenkins entered the courtroom. She wore a simple navy blue blazer and matching skirt, her gray hair neatly pulled back into a bun. At 55 years old, Sarah moved with quiet confidence, though few in the courtroom noticed her. Case number 2347, parking violation on Madison Street. The court clerk's voice echoed through the half-empty room. Judge Hartley didn't even look up from his papers. He had seen thousands of cases like this before, and in his mind, this one was no different. The ticket indicated the car had been parked in a loading zone for over 2 hours, resulting in a $500 fine. "Step forward," Judge Hartley commanded, his voice carrying the authority he had perfected over the years. He still hadn't looked up to see who stood before him. Sarah moved forward, the soft sound of her black shoes echoing on the wooden floor. She stood straight, hands clasped in front of her, patiently waiting to be addressed properly. "Do you understand why you're here today?" Judge Hartley asked, his tone already bored. He began his familiar lecture, one he had repeated countless times before. Parking regulations exist for a reason. Loading zones are essential for local businesses. Your disregard for these rules shows a lack of respect for our community's laws. The judge finally glanced up, his eyes quickly scanning Sarah's appearance. His assumption-filled mind immediately categorized her as just another person who would likely ask for a payment plan or claim hardship. "Have you pleaded guilty to the charge of illegal parking in a loading zone on March 15th, between 10 a.m. and 12:30 p.m.? He asked, his tone indicating that he expected either an excuse or a plea for leniency. The other people in the courtroom, lawyers waiting for their cases, a few courthouse regulars, and the usual staff, barely paid attention. This was just another routine morning. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but Judge Hartley cut her off. "Before you answer, let me remind you that the camera evidence clearly shows your vehicle remained in the loading zone for 2 hours and 30 minutes. That's well beyond any reasonable time for loading or unloading," he said, holding up a printed photograph showing a silver Mercedes parked in front of a school. "This is your car, correct? License plate number XRJ 2891. Sarah nodded calmly. "Yes, Your Honor. That is my car." "Then," Judge Hartley continued, settling back in his chair, "given clear evidence and the length of time involved, the fine stands at $500. Will you need a payment plan?" His tone carried the assumption that she would. The courtroom remained silent, the morning sun now fully streaming through the windows. A young intern rushed in through the back door, carrying a stack of files. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor, breaking the tense silence. Sarah stood still, her expression unchanged. She had experienced moments like this before, when people made assumptions based on nothing more than a quick glance and their own biases. The judge's secretary slipped him a note, but he waved it away, focused on wrapping up what he considered another routine case. "Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice stern, "we're waiting for your response. How do you plead, and do you require a payment plan for the fine?" What Judge William Hartley didn't know was that this seemingly ordinary Monday morning was about to become one of the most significant moments in his 15-year career on the bench. The woman standing before him was far from what he had assumed, and the next few minutes would challenge everything he thought he knew about making snap judgments. "I plead guilty to the parking violation," Sarah Jenkins spoke, her voice clear and steady, carrying naturally through the courtroom. The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly at her directness. He had expected excuses, perhaps even tears, but not this straightforward admission. He leaned forward, his reading glasses slipping further down his nose. "Well, that's refreshing," he said, though his tone suggested he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. In his experience, a guilty plea was often followed by a lengthy explanation or a plea for mercy. "However," he continued, settling into his familiar lecture mode, "I hope you understand the seriousness of this violation. Loading zones are not intended for extended parking. Local businesses depend on these spaces for their deliveries. He reached for his gavel, ready to pronounce the fine and move on to his next case. But Sarah remained perfectly still, her hands loosely clasped in front of her. The sunlight caught the simple pearl necklace at her throat, gleaming brilliantly for a moment. A few others waiting in the courtroom had started paying attention, sensing something different about this interaction. "Miss Jenkins," Judge Hartley said, his voice carrying a condescending tone, "I assume you're familiar with the concept of payment plans, given the size of the fine." Sarah interrupted him politely, but firmly, something rarely done in his courtroom. "I don't need a payment plan, Your Honor," she said, her voice calm and dignified. The judge's face darkened at the interruption. "Miss Jenkins, in my courtroom, we observe proper—" "I apologize for interrupting, Your Honor," Sarah said, still maintaining her calm tone. "But I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not here to dispute the fine or request special treatment. I'm here because I respect the law and this court." A young lawyer sitting in the back straightened up, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Even the court clerk stopped shuffling her papers, her eyes moving between the judge and the woman standing before him. Judge Hartley removed his glasses, placing them carefully on his desk. "Miss Jenkins, while I appreciate your respect for the court, the fact remains that you violated the loading zone regulation outside Carter Elementary School." Sarah finished his sentence. "Yes, I did, and I'm prepared to pay the fine in full right now." She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a checkbook bound in soft leather. The judge's face showed the first signs of confusion. This wasn't following the script he was used to. His eyes narrowed as he studied Sarah more carefully. For the first time since she'd entered his courtroom, he saw her differently. "However," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a gentle yet authoritative tone, "I believe it's important for the court to understand the context of this violation." Judge Hartley's hand tightened around his gavel. He disliked when defendants tried to justify their actions, but something in Sarah's demeanor made him hesitate before cutting her off. The morning sun had fully risen, and the courtroom was bathed in warm light. The distant sound of children playing in the schoolyard across the street could be heard. "Miss Jenkins," the judge said, his voice carrying a warning tone, "context rarely changes the nature of a violation." Sarah smiled slightly, a gesture that conveyed understanding but no mockery. "Sometimes, Your Honor, context changes everything." She stood straighter, her presence commanding attention in the room. "Would the court allow me to provide that context?" The young lawyer in the back had pulled out his phone, frantically typing. The court clerk had completely stopped pretending to work. Her eyes moved back and forth between the judge and Sarah, sensing something extraordinary unfolding. Judge Hartley found himself at a crossroads. His usual approach would be to shut down any attempts to explain and move on with the docket. But something about Sarah Jenkins, perhaps her dignity, her calm confidence, or the way she carried herself, made him pause. After what seemed like an eternity, though it was only a few seconds, Judge Hartley nodded slowly. "Proceed, Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice carrying less certainty than before. Sarah Jenkins took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Judge Hartley's directly. "Your Honor, on March 15th, I was overseeing the delivery of 35 new computers to Carter Elementary School." She paused, noting the subtle shift in the judge's expression at the mention of the school. "These computers were part of a $500,000 technology grant from the Jenkins Foundation, which I established 15 years ago." Judge Hartley leaned forward slightly, his hand frozen midair as he processed her words. "The Jenkins Foundation?" His voice faltered slightly, his mind processing the connection. He had heard his daughter, Jennifer, mention the new computers at Carter Elementary just a few weeks ago. Sarah nodded, her smile soft but genuine. "Yes, Your Honor. The same foundation that has provided over $12 million in educational grants to underfunded schools in our district over the past decade." The young lawyer in the back was typing rapidly, his eyes widening as he pulled up the Jenkins Foundation website. The court clerk had stopped pretending to work entirely, her mouth slightly open in surprise. "I deliberately parked in the loading zone that day," Sarah explained, because it was the closest access point to the school's main entrance. The computers were being delivered by volunteers, many of them senior citizens who give their time to our foundation. I wanted to minimize the distance they had to carry the equipment. Judge Hartley removed his glasses slowly, placing them carefully on his desk. His face softened, and he looked at Sarah with new eyes. "Miss Jenkins," he began, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Are you telling me that you're the Sarah Jenkins, the one who transformed our school?" Sarah nodded, her expression humble. "I'm just someone who believes every child deserves access to modern education, Your Honor." She glanced at the check she had written. "The loading zone violation was my responsibility, and I'm here to pay the fine. But I wanted you to understand that sometimes what looks like disregard for the law might actually be an attempt to serve the community in the best way possible." The morning sun filled the courtroom completely now, and Judge Hartley noticed, for the first time, the small pin on Sarah's lapel, a simple design of an open book with a rising sun. He had seen that logo before. It was the same one on the computers in his daughter's classroom. "The fine is $500, Sarah continued, already writing the check. "I'd like to request that it be directed to the court's youth program if possible. Every dollar should go toward helping our children." Judge Hartley sat back in his chair, the weight of his earlier assumptions pressing heavily on his conscience. This woman, whom he had so quickly judged and dismissed, had done more for his community and his own daughter's classroom than he had realized. The court clerk leaned forward, whispering softly to the judge. "Sir, Miss Jenkins was named Philanthropist of the Year by the City Council last month. Her foundation just announced a $10 million initiative to provide technology training for teachers, the same program your daughter was talking about." Judge Hartley stood up and walked to his window. From here, he could see Carter Elementary School across the street, where the computers Sarah had delivered were now helping students learn. His phone buzzed, a message from his daughter, Jennifer. "Dad, you won't believe who was in your courtroom today. Sarah Jenkins. She's the one who transformed our school. You met her, right?" The judge placed his phone face down on his desk. His mind replayed the morning's events. For 15 years, he had prided himself on being firm but fair. Now he wondered how many times his fairness had been clouded by unconscious assumptions. Martha, the court clerk, knocked softly before entering his chambers. "Judge Hartley, I have something you might want to see." She placed a folder on his desk, open to several newspaper clippings about the Jenkins Foundation's work. "I did some research during lunch," Martha explained. "Last month, Miss Jenkins donated her entire retirement fund, $3 million, to create scholarship programs for underprivileged students. She lives in a modest 2-bedroom apartment and drives the same Mercedes she's had for 10 years. Judge Hartley picked up one of the articles, reading about Sarah's journey. She started the foundation after selling her successful software company. She grew up in the city's poorest neighborhood, won a scholarship to MIT, and returned home determined to give others the same opportunities she had received. "There's more," Martha continued softly. "The day she got the parking ticket, one of the volunteers had a heart attack while carrying a computer. Miss Jenkins stayed with him, called 911, and then finished delivering the computers herself. That's why she was parked there so long." Judge Hartley removed his glasses slowly, rubbing his tired eyes. The weight of his earlier behavior pressed heavily on him. He thought about how quickly he had assumed Sarah would need a payment plan and how dismissively he had treated her before knowing who she was. "Your daughter's classroom," Martha added, "was chosen for the first computers because Jennifer had been using her own laptop to teach students basic coding during lunch breaks. Miss Jenkins heard about it and was impressed by her dedication." The judge stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the schoolyard. From here, he could see the children playing during their lunch break. Some of them would be using the new computers, learning skills that might change their lives, thanks to Sarah Jenkins' dedication. His phone buzzed again with a message from Jennifer. "Dad, Sarah Jenkins just visited our classroom. The kids loved the new computers. She sat with little Marcus for 30 minutes, helping him with his math program. She's amazing." Martha cleared her throat gently. "Judge, there's something else you should know. The Jenkins Foundation has been trying to start a program to provide free legal aid to low-income families. They've been looking for judges to volunteer as advisors. Judge Hartley turned from the window, his face showing the internal struggle of a man confronting his own biases. He thought about all the times he had made quick judgments from the bench, assuming he could read people's stories from their appearance or demeanor. "Martha," he said finally, his voice carrying a new tone of humility, "please clear my afternoon schedule tomorrow. I believe I have some thinking to do." He paused, glancing at the newspaper clippings again. "And see if you can get me contact information for the Jenkins Foundation." As Martha left, she stopped at the door. "Judge, for what it's worth, I've worked in this court for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone handle a situation with more grace than Miss Jenkins did this morning." Judge Hartley nodded, picking up the parking ticket that had started it all. The violation now seemed insignificant compared to the lesson it had taught him. Through the window, he watched as Sarah's silver Mercedes pulled up to the school again. She stepped out, carrying more supplies for the computer lab. At that moment, Judge William Hartley realized that true justice required more than just knowing the law. It required understanding the human stories behind each case that came before his bench. The next morning, Judge William Hartley arrived at his courtroom earlier than usual. He had spent a sleepless night thinking about Sarah Jenkins and the assumptions he had made. His regular morning coffee sat untouched on his desk as he waited for the courthouse to fill. At precisely 9 a.m., he did something unprecedented in his 15 years on the bench. He asked his clerk to gather everyone present, lawyers, defendants, court staff, and visitors, before beginning the day's proceedings. "Before we start today's cases," Judge Hartley began, his voice carrying through the now silent courtroom. The regular courthouse staff exchanged surprised glances. They had never seen Judge Hartley deviate from standard procedures. Martha, his clerk, smiled slightly, already knowing what was coming. "Yesterday, a woman named Sarah Jenkins stood before this court for a parking violation," the judge continued. "I treated her with preconceived notions and bias, based solely on her appearance. I made assumptions about her ability to pay a fine, her reasons for being in court, and her character, all before she spoke a single word." The courtroom remained silent, but the atmosphere had changed. Several people leaned forward in their seats, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Miss Jenkins," the judge went on, "runs a foundation that has donated millions to our community schools. The day she received her parking ticket, she was overseeing the delivery of computers to underprivileged students. One of her volunteers had a medical emergency, and she stayed overtime to complete the delivery herself." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But here's the most important part. None of that should matter. Whether Miss Jenkins was a philanthropist or not, she deserved to be treated with respect and dignity in this courtroom. Every person who stands before this bench deserves that same respect." Jennifer Hartley, his daughter, had slipped quietly into the back of the courtroom. She watched her father with proud tears in her eyes, recording the moment on her phone. "Therefore," Judge Hartley continued, "I want to make a public apology to Miss Jenkins and to anyone else who may have faced similar treatment in this court. I've been a judge for 15 years, and yesterday I learned one of the most important lessons of my career." Sarah Jenkins, who had been notified of the judge's intention to speak, stood quietly near the courtroom door. No one had noticed her enter, but she watched the scene unfold with gentle understanding in her eyes. "From today forward," the judge declared, "this court will implement mandatory bias training for all staff, including myself. We will establish a community feedback system to ensure we're serving justice equally to all who enter these doors." He picked up the check Sarah had written for her fine the day before. Miss Jenkins insisted on paying this fine and requested it be directed to our youth program. "I'm matching her donation personally and establishing a new court initiative to review our fine structure to ensure it doesn't disproportionately affect any segment of our community." Sarah stepped forward, drawing all eyes in the courtroom. Judge Hartley descended from his bench, another unprecedented action, and walked to meet her. "Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice carrying genuine remorse, "I apologize for my behavior yesterday. You taught this old judge a valuable lesson." Sarah smiled warmly. Judge Hartley, it takes a person of true character to acknowledge their mistakes publicly. Your words today will have more impact than any fine or ruling. The courtroom burst into spontaneous applause. Even Martha, the usually stoic court clerk, wiped tears from her eyes. Even the bailiffs looked moved. The Jenkins Foundation, Sarah added, would be honored to partner with the court on your new initiatives. Sometimes the best way forward is to work together. Judge Hartley nodded, emotion visible on his face. Court is adjourned, he declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. Let this moment set a new precedent for how justice is served in this courthouse. As Sarah left the courtroom, Judge Hartley returned to his bench, a changed man. The morning sun streamed through the windows, and for the first time in 15 years, he saw his courtroom in a completely different light. 3 months after Sarah Jenkins stood in his courtroom, Judge William Hartley's courthouse had undergone remarkable changes. The once intimidating entrance now displayed a welcoming sign in multiple languages. The stern-faced security guards had been trained in cultural sensitivity, greeting visitors with respectful smiles instead of suspicious glares. Inside his office, Judge Hartley sat reviewing the new court procedures he had implemented, with Sarah's help. The Jenkins Foundation had provided expertise and resources, helping transform how the court served its community. Judge Martha Coe, from the doorway, held a stack of folders for the day's workshop. The morning training session is about to begin, she said. The courthouse's main conference room was filled with judges, clerks, and staff from across the district. Sarah Jenkins stood at the front, sharing her experiences, not just from the parking ticket incident, but from a lifetime of facing prejudice and overcoming assumptions. Bias doesn't make you a bad person, Sarah explained to the attentive audience, but recognizing and addressing it makes you a better one. She nodded toward Judge Hartley, who sat in the front row, taking notes like a first-year law student. The changes were not just superficial. Judge Hartley had established a community advisory board, which included members from all neighborhoods and backgrounds. They reviewed court procedures, suggested improvements, and helped ensure everyone had equal access to justice. One morning, while reviewing cases, Judge Hartley noticed a young black woman looking nervous as she approached his bench. 3 months ago, he might have made quick assumptions. Instead, he remembered Sarah's words. Listen first, judge second. The woman turned out to be a single mother who had started a small catering business. She had received a citation for operating without proper permits, but only because she couldn't navigate the complex application process. By the end of the hearing, Judge Hartley had not only helped her understand the requirements, but had also connected her with a free business mentorship program. You remind me of another entrepreneur who once stood in this courtroom, he told her with a smile, thinking of Sarah. The local media began noticing the changes. The city newspaper ran a story titled Justice Transformed, How a Parking Ticket Changed a Courthouse. Judge Hartley and Sarah were invited to speak at judicial conferences, sharing their story of how one incident led to systematic change. Jennifer Hartley, the judge's daughter, saw changes in her father beyond the courthouse. He visited her classroom regularly now, reading stories to the students and using the computers Sarah had provided. The children called him Grandpa Judge, and he beamed with pride when they showed him their computer projects. One day, Sarah received a letter from Judge Hartley. Inside was a photo taken 15 years ago, when he was first appointed to the bench. I keep this to remind me of how far I've come, he wrote. Thank you for helping me become not just a better judge, but a better person. Judge Martha Coe, from the doorway, held a stack of folders for the day's workshop. The morning training session is about to begin, she said. The courthouse's main conference room was filled with judges, clerks, and staff from across the district. Sarah Jenkins stood at the front, sharing her experiences, not just from the parking ticket incident, but from a lifetime of facing prejudice and overcoming assumptions. Bias doesn't make you a bad person, Sarah explained to the attentive audience, but recognizing and addressing it makes you a better one. She nodded toward Judge Hartley, who sat in the front row, taking notes like a first-year law student. The changes were not just superficial. Judge Hartley had established a community advisory board, which included members from all neighborhoods and backgrounds. They reviewed court procedures, suggested improvements, and helped ensure everyone had equal access to justice. One morning, while reviewing cases, Judge Hartley noticed a young black woman looking nervous as she approached his bench. 3 months ago, he might have made quick assumptions. Instead, he remembered Sarah's words, "Listen first, judge second." The woman turned out to be a single mother who had started a small catering business. She had received a citation for operating without proper permits, but only because she couldn't navigate the complex application process. By the end of the hearing, Judge Hartley had not only helped her understand the requirements, but had also connected her with a free business mentorship program. "You remind me of another entrepreneur who once stood in this courtroom," he told her with a smile, thinking of Sarah. The local media began noticing the changes. The city newspaper ran a story titled "Justice Transformed: How a Parking Ticket Changed a Courthouse." Judge Hartley and Sarah were invited to speak at judicial conferences, sharing their story of how one incident led to systematic change. Jennifer Hartley, the judge's daughter, saw changes in her father beyond the courthouse. He visited her classroom regularly now, reading stories to the students and using the computers Sarah had provided. The children called him Grandpa Judge, and he beamed with pride when they showed him their computer projects. One day, Sarah received a letter from Judge Hartley. Inside was a photo taken 15 years ago when he was first appointed to the bench. "I keep this to remind me of how far I've come," he wrote. "Thank you for helping me become not just a better judge, but a better person." The Jenkins Foundation and the courthouse continued to collaborate on new initiatives. Together, they established a legal education program for high school students, teaching them about their rights and responsibilities within the justice system. The students not only learned about the law, but also about the importance of fair treatment and understanding the human stories behind each case. One day, while teaching a class with Judge Hartley, Sarah shared a story from her own childhood. "I grew up in a poor neighborhood, just 6 blocks from here. As a child, I watched other kids walk to school with their backpacks, while my mother worked 2 jobs to make sure we had food on the table. I never thought I would be the one to change things." She paused, letting the students absorb the weight of her words. But change doesn't happen overnight. It starts with one person deciding to make a difference. Judge Hartley, sitting beside her, nodded in agreement. "That's right. Sometimes, the smallest actions have the greatest impact." The class listened intently, inspired by the powerful lessons being shared. Judge Hartley had become a mentor to many of the young lawyers, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds. His reputation had shifted. He was no longer known as the strictest judge in the county, but as one of the fairest, someone who truly listened to people before passing judgment. The biggest transformation, however, was in his approach to justice. No longer relying solely on the law to guide his decisions, he made an effort to understand the context behind every case, ensuring that everyone who entered his courtroom was treated with dignity and respect. One morning, while reviewing cases, Judge Hartley noticed a young woman approaching the bench. She looked nervous and unsure, and for a moment, he thought of his past self, how he might have quickly judged her based on her appearance. But then he remembered Sarah's words, "Listen first, judge second." The woman explained that she had received a citation for operating a food truck without the proper permits. She had been unable to navigate the complicated paperwork because English was her second language. After listening to her story, Judge Hartley worked with her to find a solution that would help her comply with the rules without imposing a harsh fine. He connected her with a local immigrant support group that offered free legal assistance and guidance. As he watched the woman leave, relieved and grateful, Judge Hartley realized how far he had come. He had gone from being a judge who saw only violations to one who saw people, each with their own struggles, hopes, and dreams. The work Sarah had done, and the lessons he had learned from her, had changed him in ways he never expected. The courthouse had become a model for reform, not just in their district, but across the state. Other courts reached out to Judge Hartley, asking for advice on how to implement similar changes. He and Sarah spoke at judicial conferences, sharing their story of how a single incident, a parking ticket, had led to a transformation in the way justice was delivered. "Start by listening," Judge Hartley often told his colleagues. Real change begins when we stop assuming and start understanding. A year after the parking ticket incident, the courthouse held a special ceremony to honor their achievements. The main hall was filled with judges, lawyers, community leaders, and students from Carter Elementary. Above the entrance hung a new plaque, reading, "Justice Serves All," the Jenkins-Hartley Initiative for Equal Justice. Sarah Jenkins sat in the front row, wearing the same navy blue blazer she had worn on that fateful morning in traffic court. Beside her sat Judge William Hartley, his silver hair neatly combed, his usual stern expression replaced by a warm smile. "Who would have thought," Sarah whispered to him, "that a parking ticket could change so many lives?" The program they had built together had spread beyond their city. 20 other courthouses across the state had adopted their training methods, and the Jenkins Foundation had created a special division dedicated to judicial reform. They worked with courts nationwide to implement bias training and community outreach programs. Jennifer Hartley, now the principal of Carter Elementary, stood at the podium, sharing stories of the changes she had witnessed. "Last week, a student asked me why the judge in a picture book looked so mean," she said with a smile. Another student replied, "Judges aren't mean. Just ask Grandpa Judge." The crowd laughed warmly as Judge Hartley blushed. The computer lab at Carter Elementary had become a model for other schools, and students who had never touched a computer were now coding their own programs. Sarah visited regularly, mentoring young girls interested in technology. She often told them the story of Mrs. Peterson, the 7th grade math teacher who first showed her that dreams had no boundaries. Judge Hartley's court had become a training ground for new judges. They came to observe his transformed approach to justice, how he listened carefully to each case, how he ensured everyone felt heard and respected, regardless of their background. The parking ticket that started it all now hung framed in Judge Hartley's office, next to a photograph of Sarah helping students in the Carter Elementary Computer Lab. It served as a daily reminder that justice wasn't just about following the law, it was about understanding the people those laws affected. The local bar association had created an annual award in their honor, the Jenkins-Hartley Award for Excellence in Judicial Fairness. The first recipient was Martha, the court clerk who had helped start the transformation by bringing those newspaper clippings to the judges' chambers. As Sarah and Judge Hartley continued their work together, they established a new scholarship program, the Equal Justice Initiative, to support minority students pursuing careers in law. The program was funded jointly by the Jenkins Foundation and the court system, and it gave young people the opportunity to follow in Sarah's footsteps, becoming advocates for justice and equality in their communities. At a ceremony marking the 1-year anniversary of the parking ticket incident, Sarah addressed the crowd. "I walked into this courthouse expecting just another day of dealing with assumptions and prejudice," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Instead, I found an opportunity for transformation." Judge Hartley stood beside her, his face showing the humility that had come to define his career. "I could have simply taken her fine and moved on," he said. "Instead, I chose to learn, to change, and to make a difference." The crowd applauded, and Sarah smiled at the judge. "Sometimes," she said, "the biggest changes come from the smallest moments. All it takes is the courage to acknowledge our mistakes and the willingness to learn from them." As they left the ceremony, Sarah and Judge Hartley passed by courtroom 304, where it had all begun. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, just as it had that morning a year ago. But now, the light fell on a very different courthouse, one where justice truly served all. Outside, Sarah's silver Mercedes was parked in the loading zone again. But this time, there was a special permit on the dashboard, one that read Jenkins-Hartley Community Service Vehicle. Some rules had changed, but more importantly, the way they were applied had transformed.